Okay, that's cool.
We have a game tomorrow, right, PJ?
Yeah.
Or you got another wedding you have to go to?
No. No weddings.
That's kind of mean, Carl.
Well,
Another
I have
wedding that you
wedding,
have to go to.
Right.
Yeah, like I went out of town. Yeah, I was actually.
PJ wasn't really at a wedding. He was sitting at home doing his yearly watch of Strange Brew. That's what that was.
Most unlikely of villains, schools of pain and for pause. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? Lair of the cerebral bore, and will show him so much more. When you go brains at the door.
Okay, folks, welcome back to Cerebrivore. I'm your host, Jason, from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. Today, we've got our original Not Ready for Primetime players. We have Carl Rodriguez, the Geomologist Presents, BJ Boyd of The Arcane Alienist, and Arlen Walker of Live from Pelham's Wasteland. We don't have Joe Richter of Hindsightless here today, but I have a beer sitting here on the table. We have a place set for him, so his memory is with us. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Wow, you say it like he's dead, Jason. His memory is with us.
Well, yes, it is that month. We're in the scariest month of the year.
Yeah,
we're not in the scariest month of the year yet. Maybe by the time people listen to it, but not when we're recording.
Unless
you think that September is the scariest month,
creative editing will fix that faux pas there, Mr. Walker.
Well, maybe we're just finding out that you think September is scarier than October.
Maybe.
Is it?
Because it's named for 7, but it's the 9th month of the year.
There you go. Good question.
Pretty scary.
All right. So what we're going to do today, folks, is each of us are going to ask a impromptu question of the other panel members. We don't know what each other's questions are, but it's just to generate some conversation. And then we have a call-in, a kind of lengthy call-in from one of our listeners, MW, the World's of MW Lewis podcast. That part of the podcast is called MW on the Crack Pipe. But before we get to the crack pipe, we have our question segments. So do people have questions ready, or do you want me to go first? Up to you guys.
Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah, Jason, why don't you go first and show us how it's done?
Okay. And these aren't necessarily gotcha questions. They're like, so this is a...
Oh, mine's going to be a gotcha question.
Well, that's fine. That's okay, too. We've opened this up to any kind of gaming questions. These are RPG questions. So we have limited it to that, to the focus of the podcast. These aren't outside of gaming. But my question is, Professor Dungeon Master over at Dungeon Craft YouTube channel has mentioned this recently, and it's also been in the zeitgeist due to the amazing success of Easy D6. I don't know if any of you guys picked up Easy D6 by DM Scotty that's being published by Runehammer Games. Are you guys familiar with that?
I can't remember if I have or not.
Okay. Well, so one thing that DM Scotty has kind of popularized is this idea of luck dice. And he has it in his Easy D6 game as Karma. And it's basically the same kind of idea. So Easy D6 is based around D6s. It works a little bit different. But the idea is whenever a player fails a roll, they get a die. And it, depending on the system, but so we'll just do the luck dice version, which is applicable to D20 games, right? You can put it into 5e, you can put it into whatever game. So the idea here is if you fail roll, you fail check, then you get a D6, a luck die, and you only get one a turn. And you can cash those luck dice in whenever you want to add to a roll. So if you make a D20 roll, you miss it, you can throw that D6 in there to try to make that roll a success. You can use to add to damage, you can use it to soak damage. And the idea here is that if a player's having a bad day, the dice just aren't with them that day, yeah, it's never fun. But this kind of helps mitigate that a little bit, that play experience. And also, the other reason he talks about doing this is the idea that you don't want players, especially if you're doing one-shots in some of these systems, you don't want the characters to die in the first encounter right away, immediately in the game. And then you have to contrive a way for them to have if we're sitting down for a 4-hour session and Carl's character dies in the first 15 minutes due to a bad die roll, then, then we have to come up with a way to incorporate another character for him, or, he has to go pick the pizza up or something, right? But either way, it's probably not super fun for Carl. So that's kind of the idea behind luck dice. Any thoughts on that? Those kind of mechanics in games?
So what's the actual question again?
What's your opinion of adding a mechanic like that to a game that doesn't normally have a meta mechanic? So adding that, I know 5e has inspiration, but adding it to something like that.
It's funny you mentioned that, because the play test they've just started in September. One of the first proposed rules changes was you're gonna get inspiration every time you roll a d20, and which a lot of people didn't like. And the feedback I think they got a lot of feedback. People didn't like that, and they picked up on this idea that, okay, well, how about if we try out, you get an inspiration every time you roll a 1 and fail.
Yeah, and
so,
this predates that change. So yeah, it may be. I mean, this probably predates DM Scotty to some degree. He's the first person I've really seen pushing it, but it's probably out there in the game somewhere.
Well,
I think that was people were suggesting, why don't we get it on a 1? And I think they actually referenced DM Scotty's.
Right. Well, it's empowered by the apocalypse, right? If you fail, you mark an experience point, that kind of thing. So
yeah, I think it's a classic concept of. I think especially it sort of depends on the kind of type of game and the style of game, I guess. I think the big thing that I would be interested in is relating kind of that sort of luck element and the sort of action economy of the game, right? I mean, like with because we mentioned Easy D6 and Runehammer, right? In ICRPG, one of the ideas is everything is in turns. And a lot of the game is kind of built around that structure that, you can try to do any number of things, but your time is your resource, right? And I think that's something that would be a kind of major factor with something like this. Or obviously there's the kind of easy sort of bad faith examples that we would, as a DM, probably just say, no, you don't get luck for, having a net of a -1 and trying to pick the lock over and over again and failing, right? You don't get luck each time you try to fail.
Right.
And fail to pick the lock. Unless it's like, well, if you don't pick it in 3 turns, then, the monsters are going to come around the corner sort of thing. In which case I probably would say, okay, well, yeah, if you're, if it's a trade-off, I think that's the big thing with me is I would say that in order for the kind of flow to work, right, you want the kind of economy to be based around the idea that, you didn't get something that you wanted from the roll, but you get the luck to kind of balance that out. And so if you don't have anything that you care about when you roll, then you don't get any luck to balance that out, right?
Right. And one of the rules in here is that if you've used luck on a failed roll, you can't get luck for that roll, kind of thing. So if if it's one of the, but yeah, and you only get 1 a turn too.
Yeah.
So it kind of keeps
I think
throwing
that
too much away.
Well, and it's interesting because it's mechanically, it's fairly similar to how Bardic Inspiration works in 5e. Although Bardic Inspiration, I don't think you can use it for damage or.
This is a little wider.
Yeah.
So a little wider, but it is a kind of fairly similar concept of roll your d20 and then add an extra die and I kind of like, I tend to like those sorts of like roll your d20 and then you have extra dice to add to that, because obviously if you have some sense of how difficult something is, that creates, I think, an interesting decision for the player, right? That if you roll a 20, you're like, I probably don't need the D6. You roll a 1, you're like, the D6 is probably not going to be enough to get over the difficulty. But if you roll, like a 9 and you think that the difficulty is like a 13 or 14, that becomes a real interesting decision of, well, do I use it here or do I wait and hope that I get closer next time to get a more bang for my buck on the luck rather than spending it on a roll? And do you get luck for a roll that you said you don't get luck if you spent luck on the roll and failed.
Right.
So
yeah. And then the D6 version is each luck point is a pip.
Yeah.
So if you've got 2 luck points, you can add 2 pips to your D6 roll.
Yeah.
Effectively, right? Which makes sense. Obviously you wouldn't use this like in Savage Worlds because Benny's already do this, but it'd be
they have
useful.
Something in Savage Worlds like that too. They have conviction.
Right. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. But this is more of an add-on for like, OSC or like ICRPG or.
If I remember correctly, the pure luck dice version, which is just added into the other system you want, is an actual D6, and there's no
It is.
limit to how many you can get. So you can just
Right.
stumble through the whole adventure, just barely survive. And then I picture like the Haggard adventure. They finally get to the big boss and they're like, I've had enough. This has been the worst day of my life. And they just start dropping fistfuls of D6.
Right. And that's
Before
example
rating.
he gives. Yeah, that's the example he gives in the rules. You can DM Scotty sells these for 99 cents, the luck die rule book. And it's the example he gives in there is that it's a player using it to two luck dice to successfully make an attack, one luck dice to add damage to finish off one monster, and a luck die to knock down the amount of damage that character took on one turn.
Well, and that would be the big thing, I think, is if you have I think one tweak that would be really easy to do is just add you can't spend more luck dice on damage than you spent on the attack or something like that, so that you can't just be like, oh, here's the monster and here's all of my luck into killing this monster before it gets a chance to attack, because I think that would be kind of against the spirit of what it's going for, right? But if you made it something like, okay, well, if you spend 2 luck dice on your attack, then you can spend up to 3 luck dice on your damage also, that might be kind of a clever way to handle something like that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
the
I think
good
if
thing
you do
is
that-
this is
Yeah, if you do that, I feel like it could be like an exploit.
Yeah.
Right? If you just save everything till the end, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I
Well,
mean,
yeah, it'd be a kind of tweaking thing, but I don't know exactly how you would get it all.
I would, if you're accumulating big handfuls of die, I don't know if I would want to do I don't know if I would want to do it like a per session, like you do with hero points.
well, yeah, these clear in his version, they go away at the end of the game, at the end of the session.
Well, because then everybody's going to go Nova. They're going to look at the clock and go, oh, it's 10:30.
Yeah.
It's time to everybody go Nova with your
Yeah,
luck
that's the
dice.
danger. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it depends a lot on the type of game that you're playing, I think, right? Because it's a little bit like some of the resources like in the Forged in the Dark games that I think they do kind of an interesting thing along those lines in some ways, where a lot of the resources are really tied to the fiction flow rather than to the session flow. And so you get the kind of Nova effect sometimes, but it's always on like the last stage of the heist, not as like, oh, we're coming up on 10 o'clock, so everybody spend your points before they go away, even because we're not going to get through this dungeon tonight, sort of thing, which always, I like the fiction tied version a lot more. But
Right. Okay. Well, we kind of, Carl hasn't been able to get in very much. So I'm going to let Carl finish this out, and then we're going to throw out for another question because we're about to the end of the time, my time.
So since I'm a player's GM, notoriously, I'm all for it. It'd be good to add it. I think there should be some modification so that you can't have like this giant, pool of dice at the end and you can't accumulate them. I think that happens in like Fate games too, where you can accumulate all your +2 bonuses until the very end. So that kind of, to me, defeats the challenge of the big boss or the big encounter at the end. So I think there should be something where you got to use it or lose it type of thing incorporated into that. Or you have a pool, like I think I've done this with in our Hyperborea game, where you have a pool of like fortune points or whatever we're calling them, and the players can use them for various things. Whether it's I don't think we've quite used it for damage, but you can use it to mitigate bad things that happen to you. And I don't mind that. Like if you need like a D6 for a saving throw because you barely missed it, right? Or you need a D6 for damage to extra D6 or whatever the amount of the luck dice is to hurt the monster a little more that you're fighting, maybe take it down or something like that. That's not or to hit. I don't mind that. I don't mind that at all. So I'm for it, but it just needs to be examined so that players who are smart, because most players are pretty savvy about that kind of stuff and looking for exploits all the time. Arlen Walker. So so yeah. I'm kidding. No, but I have players who are savvy like that. So you got to really, they question everything, right? They question everything. So I think you got to look for ways that it can be broken and tweak it there. So it's fun for both the players and the GM and for all the players, right? Because if one player figures out how to exploit it and then throws down all the dice, casts the big psychic wave of death, and the other player's like, well, why am I here?
Yeah, that would be it seems like if you have like a spell that attacks multiple targets, right? Put damage on that one and get your damage on everything versus a single sword strike that you only get the damage on the one target.
Yeah.
Right.
So it sounds like we all like it. Just maybe tweak it for our tables. So
Yeah.
excellent.
Uh-oh.
Speaking of Anglo-Saxon, I learned today that the word Gotham means goat town in Anglo-Saxon.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never seen a reference to goats in Batman.
So Carl, do you want to throw the next question out?
No, because I didn't do my homework this time, so I got to think about a question real quick.
Okay.
All right, so go ahead. Someone else.
I have a feeling Arlen has one.
Yeah, I've got one. So my thought was sort of about the idea of I guess structure isn't quite the right term, but some type of not a person, but essentially an NPC that is involved in a sort of almost like a communal property of the group. So I think about like a pirate ship in a pirate game, right? Where there's this idea of a sort of something that is, or like a secret base in a superhero game, or even like doesn't one of the WotC D&D adventures have like a caravan or something that you're involved in?
Well, they have based off the actual play where they get all the missions, right? Was it
all right. Well, I don't
incorporated?
Remember, but anyway, but the idea being of a sort of kind of like an extra, or even sort of like a castle in old school games, right? If you hit 9th level and are able to build a stronghold. And I guess my question is, how much kind of like control or explicit kind of rule structure do you want around something like that when you're playing, right? Like if you've got the pirate ship, do you want like the DM just does everything pirate shippy behind the scenes, or do you want like here's the speed in like knots, I guess is what they measure speed for boats in mostly, and then here's like you can pay 200 more gold and get an extra set of sails and get a little faster, and here's what the crew's morale is like and all that sort of stuff essentially.
I think that's where the new Spelljammer kind of fell flat, was that ships are basically floating platforms on which to engage in skirmishes with other creatures. There's not any kind of rules for customizing the ship, making it go faster, slower, maneuvering it, ship to ship battles or anything like that as they're closing in on each other, or escape and evasion. But a long time ago, I wish I can remember who said this, was when you give players a ship, whatever game you were playing before now becomes a game of customizing a ship. Whether you're playing Star Wars or Traveler, where that you have to have a ship, or whether you're playing D&D and they manage to secure a ship, the first thing they want to do is, well, how can we soup up this ship? A base of operations they might be interested in, but it just kind of stays there, and you just want to make sure it's safe for them to come home to. That's kind of what they're at. But the ship, they're like, well, we can take this with us, and we can attack places, and we can go play. And if you're not ready for that, that's maybe a session 0 or maybe like a session 0 part 2, where you get to that phase of the campaign, goes, okay, guys, look, before you guys take ownership of this ship, let's talk about this. Or did we sign up, or are we all here to play a game where you spend lots of gold and resources customizing a ship and having to hire a crew? And well, how many hit points do each of my crew, or do you want the game where I just say, yeah, it takes you this long to sail from place A to place B, and then now you're at a new low venture. It's like it basically drops you off of the dungeon, and you move forward. I encountered that in Storm King's Thunder. There's a point in Storm King's Thunder where they get access to an airship, and then overland travel just becomes a matter of
nothing. Yeah,
nothing. And as a result of having a ship that can take them from places to places with travel times that sometimes take a couple of days, they could have their kind of big battle, and then a long rest and a full recovery was just guaranteed. It became this weird. Whereas before, when they were having to travel across land, you could throw random encounters and challenges and things like that. And they get to bypass, I think, parts of the story, which is supposed to reinforce kind of the narrative of that adventure path. So there are lots of implications of having it. And I know I'm going on about a ship and not necessarily castles or keeps or, Carl, he wants to buy a tavern now in Village of Omelet.
Yeah, well, I can speak to that as far as I was in Carl's game. Carl used to run a game called Broken Lands. Hopefully it's just on hiatus, where we were playing monsters. It's based on the works of our gazetteer for Beckman. And in that, our gang had gotten a hold of an area. It was a hideout, like a hideout. And we did spend money and effort and we did worry about customizing the hideout and protecting it, and we had our own gang that we hired, henchmen that we hired and all to guard. And before we went on a mission, you had to decide who's going to stay back and guard the base of operations and all that. So even a base of operations takes that kind of planning. And the good thing is that the stuff for the base of operations is pretty easily available. Lamentations of Flame Princess has even the free version has pretty good basic rules for doing all that management kind of stuff. And then if you want detailed stuff, Axe, Venture Conquer King system has really detailed stuff. But the stuff in Lamentations really is plenty for most games. And like I say, you can get the free version of it that has it all. But yeah, you can, and that's definitely a great way to fleece characters of gold. If you're not playing AD&D First Edition, if you're not doing training costs, then ships or keeps or hideouts are great ways to get gold out of your character's hands, because they can suck them up quick. But Carl probably can offer a lot more insight than I can on this.
Well, I think that's the main thing. Is like, what do the players do with their gold, right? First, talking about Broken Lands, right? You in BX especially, whereas in AD&D they have rules for like training, so that kind of takes your money from that. And then there's like this idea of domain play later on in BX. I mean, we just have like in our OSE Temple of Elemental Evil game, we have so much money. What the hell are we going to do with it? The same thing happened in Broken Lands. They get so much money. What are they going to do with it? So that's in a way is a good way to start domain play early, and that's a good way to have that going. And I think I took inspiration from Hexcrawl and Eric Hoffman and company did, Paul Wolf, Cody Mazza, Jason Hobbs, etc. What they did, and they had simple rules for what happens in the background while you're off adventuring to your domain. So you can roll for encounters and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that is inspired by, what's that guy's name? Kevin Crawford's, Red Tide and Echo Resounding and stuff like that too. So there's ways to definitely do it. And I think it's a cool thing. And what I always think is fascinating to me, to answer Arlen's question, is that I feel like there's always like one player who really grabs hold of that. Like when we were talking about wanting to start a Kingmaker game, for example, one of my players was like, oh yeah, he's already started reading through the player's guide, the 87-page player's guide for Kingmaker. And he's like, that has everything for domains and how to build your kingdom. I want to do it. So he's very excited about it. The same type of player who loves to do the trading in space trucking when you play that version of Traveler. It's like that same as I remember I had a player who was a noble who owned the yacht, who wanted to do space trucking, had this is way back, like in the 90s when Excel was first coming out and spreadsheets were like a big thing and not everyone knew how to work them. Now everyone kind of should. But, you would have a spreadsheet and how you do your space trucking and how you sell high, sell high, buy low, all that kind of stuff. You really got into it. So I think you always have players who do that. And I think that encourages them who maybe they're not the ones who are the face. They're not going to play the horny bard who talks to everyone, in the adventure, or they're not the one who likes to optimize and beat everyone up. But there are some players who just like the intellectual game within the game, right? And it's funny that some design, I say Paizo is probably the most notorious or known for it, is that every single adventure path has some sort of mini game, right? So like Age of Ashes, heat building, right? So Abomination Vault, surprisingly, I don't think it really has a mini game, although there's kind of like interaction with NPCs and building your own fortune in the town, kind of. But then they had one where like you build this, you design and build and maintain a caravan to go over the spine of the world. That's in one of the adventure paths, right? You have the ship thing in Skulls and Shackles. So, and of course, in Kingmaker, famously building a kingdom. So I think it's cool. I think it's fun, and hopefully you'll have a new group, that player who wants to do it, because then it takes less off the GM, right? And I think in Broken Lands we had people who were interested in designing the keep and maintaining it, and people who were in the other part of the Broken Lands, maintaining the little city state, right, that was formed. And I think it's a fun part of gameplay. Really, it makes it feel like it's more than just you're kicking in the doors and killing monsters and taking their stuff. You feel like you make a mark in the world. The world changes. I guess that's kind of the cool thing about it. And even more recently, like yesterday, and I finished Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh for 5e, and there's a chance that the character spoiler get a ship, and of course they want the ship. They're like, oh my gosh, it's like a taxi. Right.
And if I recall, in the original AD&D version of the module, the DM is instructed under no circumstances to allow the characters to. You're supposed to like, oh no, the ship is on fire, abandoned ship. Whatever you do, don't let them take the ship.
But I know players now. I don't know. It's not players nowadays, but I guess maybe I'm fortunate that a lot of my players just don't. Maybe it's because the games they play or their interests. Like one guy made a comment that this is becoming parallel to Warhammer Fantasy. We have a boat, and this player character are collecting a menagerie of animals. So there's some players that have a type, right, and that's the way they play in every game. And I don't, hey, if one player wants to start collecting all the animals that you can get, like it's World of Warcraft, and you're collecting pets, that's awesome. I think it's better. I mean, I think because honestly, like the trigger of mine is cruelty to animals and killing animals. So I love it to have a player that if we find a guard dog, we're not going to kill the guard dog. We're going to do the animal handling thing to try to control the guard dog. And now it's our pet. I think that's awesome. So, I don't mind. I don't mind. I guess the question that you asked, Arlen, having that domain, having that game within a game, and NPCs in the background. And actually, in the 5e version here in Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, it says that the kingdom will give on loan a crew to pilot the ship, right? So in a way, players don't have to worry about it. They can if they want to.
Yeah, so that would go back to what BJ said, the idea that when it comes up, make sure to have that separate stop the game or have that section,
you have
section
to, right?
0.2 and say, listen, do you guys want to count the beans and the barrels of water, and do you want to count all the number crunching that takes to maintain this, or do you just want me to hand wave it? What kind of game do you want to play? And
I think that's kind of neat.
Yeah,
that's neat that the Saltmarsh one gives you that option. They can either control the boat, or hey, it's on loan from the kingdom. So then the kingdom, it's like a rental. The kingdom pays for all the maintenance.
No, that's cool.
Another thing that comes up with this, whether you're talking about a castle or a ship or whatever, is whose ship is it? This is a team game. It's a team sport, and we're all equals and we're all partners. But who's the lord of that named the lord of that castle? Who's the captain of that ship? And I know I think the most recent Casting Shadows, Anthony was talking about his Star Trek game, and one of the things that's presented in Star Trek is the captain is an NPC that is just kind of owned by the party. The DM can control them, or it's just kind of there, and then players can take turns kind of role playing the captain if you need the captain to do something, but it's sort of an idea that we're not going to make anybody the captain of the ship. And I know in Traveler, ships are investments and everybody owns shares in the ship, and it kind of takes care of it that way. But when you're thinking about kind of D&D style games, it's like, okay, well, somebody owns this ship. Or somebody's at least if we all own it, somebody's the captain. Or maybe we all own this property. It kind of goes against the medieval grain to think that a duke is going to say, well, the 5 of you have really impressed me, so you now communally own 60 acres in the North Farthing and build a castle, and you're all jointly lords and ladies of.
Yeah, it's usually going to be like 1, right? That's the yeah. I guess that in Star Trek, I don't know. I feel like there's characters who are in command, and they're the ones who are in charge. So you can actually be like a PC who is the captain of your boat, right?
I think he was talking about being an option. It's not like
okay.
That's one way of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a great example is Ars Magica, right? If you've ever played Ars Magica, one person is the magician, and everyone else is like a sidekick. And how does that? I've never played it or run it, so I don't know how that dynamic works, right? Or I guess essentially it seems like in most group dynamics, one person's going to say, "Okay, I'll do that," or I'll volunteers to do that. I'm going to be the quartermaster. I'm going to be the note taker. I'm going to be the mapper. Okay, I'm going to be in charge. And some people are cool with that. Some people are not. I know, like in Skulls and Shackles, everyone sort of said, "Okay, no, you seem like you'd be the best." They kind of looked at everyone's skill set, and they were egalitarian enough and I guess metagamey enough to like, okay, that guy should be the captain because he has X, right? But then the helmsman was a different person because the helmsman had the best boating skill or whatever, right? Yeah, so there's different roles, and I think Starfinder does a great job with that too, is being able to put people into roles. So like the captain's not going to be the dude with the broadsword and the patch, in Starfinder. It's going to be the guy who can talk to the other ships better and command, has those skills to command better, as opposed to gunning or shooting or engineering or piloting, right? So it's really interesting. So some games do that. I think Star Trek in a way is interesting in that it has, like, if you're the chief engineer, you have a group of people under you, like faceless, I guess are they yellow shirts, right? In engineering, is it yellow in engineering, that are under you, that in operations that do stuff, right? So where he's in command, you have a bunch of red shirts that Captain Kirk throws in front of the Gorn to get eaten. So
yeah. Okay. So I think we've done our 15 minutes there. I will reach out to Anthony to see if he is interested in coming on, if you guys want to do a cast on Troop Play, and we can invite him on here to do that.
Yeah.
If you guys are, I think that'd be an interesting topic. So we'll get him on here for that. He's definitely said he'd love to come back on.
Current world issues.
Is that why goth kids strive to be so pasty?
And a lot of that is kind of late romantic art. And so I suspect it's just too many kids reading Edgar Allan Poe and being like, oh, I want to be like the Raven because he's so cool.
Probably. Or the
Crow.
Crow.
Yeah, but do you remember
we need Joe on for this one.
Yeah.
The Crow, right?
Now it's time for another question. So since Carl is working on his homework still, we're going to throw it to BJ.
Oh boy. I just think, and I think we may have touched on this before in other topics, in other panel discussions, and probably individually at various times, but what's the most efficient way to get players to, you've done a little bit of world building, you've got a presumed culture or societal system that you've set up. How do you get players to pay attention to it without just constantly hammering over the head of, you can't do that, that's illegal in this world? no, you can't do that because that's not how the gold works. And this, how many times do I have to tell you that we use the silver standard, not the gold standard, because sometimes I think as a DM, you almost don't want to homebrew anything because people just read what's in the player's handbook and they don't absorb when you say, well, we're going to do things a little different to go for a different tone or a different mood or a different flavor.
That's a good question.
Scratching their heads.
So how do you prevent players from? I think that goes to like communication in session 0. Really is this is the way the society works. Hopefully the characters buy in, and you have to be prepared as a GM to like, okay, you had the discussion, right? You can't. I don't think you can blindside them suddenly. So if they're used to playing a certain way, and then you're going to be put in. Say they're used to playing a certain way in the Wild West of D&D world, D&D verse, and then you throw them into like a game like Iron Kingdoms, where there's a strong central government and society. There are certain norms and etiquette. It's kind of more like a Victorian England or 19th century England in mindset, complete with trains too. So you have to let them know what society's like, and you can't just go around killing the men at arms in the town, right? This is not the Wild West. It's strict rules and stuff. And then if they do step out, then hey, I've warned you. You got to GM. You have to be prepared to attempt to punish them, right? And sometimes that might be hard because their players can be pretty powerful. You can't just let's say like in Waterdeep, if they mess up, you can't all of a sudden you could punish them pretty severely, but I don't know. You have to be prepared to do that, I guess, if they act out. I think.
Yeah, I think it often. I mean, I think one of the big things is that there's a measure of, for lack of a better term, kind of good faith mistakes versus not caring, I guess. So, I mean, one of the big things with that being, I agree that it depends a lot on kind of session 0, and I think it often helps a lot. Perhaps if you're not actually calling what you're playing D&D, that if especially when you get players who have played a lot of like a specific game and you just say, oh, we're going to play this game but with these differences, I think it can be easy for the but with these differences to sort of fade into the background or become a source of friction, right? I mean, you see that the various stories all the time of people being like, what, you won't allow this feat in your 5e game? And it's like, well, this is not an Adventurers League game, so no, I'm not going to have this particular feat that you were excited to use, and we didn't talk about it at all, and so not necessarily interested in doing that. But I think also it's, I mean, I think the thing is that there's times when everybody is going to forget elements of the setting and stuff like that, and that it really, I think, is built on sort of judiciously as a DM recognizing the difference between a player saying, well, I want to say something and saying, hey, just be aware this is not like a place where your player character is like allowed to do that sort of stuff. Are you sure? Versus a character who says, well, I say something, and it's like, oh, you just don't care about any of this, so you're going to speak up like that and in the presence of the king, and the king's going to be like, get this asshole out of here, sort of thing, right? That's a difficult line to walk often.
I'm thinking mostly of good faith mistakes where it's just one of those things that how do you constantly make the setting live and breathe so that people kind of immerse themselves in it?
Well, and I think there's a lot of, so I think one of the big things that you can do is really I think about, for instance, the way that like nature documentaries handle a lot of their storytelling, because often, right, a nature documentary is sort of built around, often there's some amount of kind of plot story, something that they've kind of come up with out of footage or things like that. But a lot of the kind of total runtime is sort of explaining this particular world. And so I think there's a number of things that kind of come into that, right? So you get the start with the sort of simple elements, and especially the kind of simple elements that are really easy to follow for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience in this world. There's an old BBC series called Walking with Dinosaurs, and then they did Walking with Prehistoric Beasts, and then they did I think one about like early humans that's kind of Australopithecines on into like Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. All that. Anyway, in Walking with Beasts in particular, there's one episode that I really, really love that starts with the male of this pride of Smilodon saber-toothed tigers essentially is deposed by a pair of brother Smilodon males. And so it works very much like it does with modern day lions on a savanna, right? That there's only room for one leader at the top, but these two, they're brothers, so they work together. And so they're able to outfight Halftooth, who's got a broken tooth. So that's why he's called Halftooth, right? But it's a really very, very simple plot structure, essentially, right? It's about as simple as you can get. Halftooth is kicked out. He is not really in shape to hunt for himself anymore, so he's got to figure out how to beat the brothers and get the pride of Smilodon back. Otherwise, he's going to starve to death, right? Really, really simple kind of plot-wise. And then most of the runtime is just spent kind of, here's what's going on in the world and how it happens to relate to this kind of really strong core plot element that is kind of our sort of character-centric focus, right? That you know, if we care about Halftooth the Smilodon, then we care when, you know, there's a Megatherium, which is basically a giant ground sloth, which is huge, and it basically beats one of the brothers to death, and so then Halftooth's got a chance and he's going to get back. And it's, you know, that's I think there's a lot to be learned from that in terms of trying to explain or to convey understanding of especially a kind of complicated world that does not necessarily fit a lot of the players' kind of preconceptions from like other D&D games. I mean, even basic stuff, you know, like I think a lot of D&D players just assume, oh, of course you can just, you know, walk around with all your weapons and find somebody to fight for. And it's like, well, you know, if you look at the historical evidence, the people who have, you know, a serious investment in, you know, the stability of an economic productivity of a region often don't want adventurers to just kind of walk up and say, hey, where's some goblins we can kill and some stuff we can loot? Because as in real life, murder hoboism is a very easy shift for adventurers. And so, you know, the first time you present a set of player characters with, here's like a mercenary contract, I think some of them will be like, what the hell is this? What do you mean like an actual like mercenary contract that's like, here's the expectations for what you're supposed to do, and here's exactly how much you get paid, and you're entitled to 60% of the loot that you recover, but the other 40% has to come back to the coffer, sort of thing, right? But that is something that I think you can totally kind of explain at the beginning. And especially if you're, you know, depending on how you're playing, if you have a way to, you know, share notes or have like a handout in a Roll20 game or something, putting, you know, maybe like a bullet list of here's the most important things to keep in mind that you've had happen so far is, I think, an easy way to just be like, hey, you know, pay attention that this is going to be a little different than what you're expecting. And I think it does really help if you know, if people sign up to play Pendragon, they come in with a lot more expectations about playing the feudalism game than if they come in and say, hey, we're playing D&D, right? And you say, well, we're playing D&D, but you're going to have to memorize some genealogy first.
Yeah, and that's where I was going to go with, is what Arlen hit there at the end. Even though we don't want to hear it as a DM, you've got to have player buy-in before you start it. If you want to do your custom thing and your players just don't care, they just want to go out and you know, kill stuff and kill things and take their loot can't talk, you know, but you know what I'm saying. If the players have in their mind they just want to play D&D, they don't want to play Pendragon, but you really want to run Pendragon, then you need to find a group that really wants to play Pendragon.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. And unfortunately, that's the sad truth. If you have this cool sword and planet setting set up, and you're using D&D 5e rules, but you're playing sword and planet, and so you've got all these tweaks, and the society's tweaked and all, and your players aren't interested in that, they're just not gonna. You know what I mean. They've got to have full buy-in. So without player buy-in, I don't think you're going to get there. I think if you have player buy-in, those good faith mistakes, Arlen gave us a lot of great ways to work with that. And Carl's right. Once you lay down the thing and they agree to it, then I mean there have to be consequences too. It doesn't mean you have to execute a player that makes a faux pas, but throwing them in jail overnight or something is and teach them, hey, you really can't call the king a douchebag. Might be appropriate, right? So yeah.
I mean, what if the king is a high level spellcaster? Just polymorph anything, and you're like a rock now.
Yeah, I mean, it's, but it's.
I
I think it comes down to good faith, right? The good faith.
Yeah,
versus
I think it's I think if it's a player that's just they didn't think about it, and I think that's often it's kind of an odd thing that you get into like discussion, right? That sometimes players want to have like, hey, can we, have a sidebar as a party that takes no time at all in the game world, but lets us all get onto the same page. And that sort of also goes under session 0, right? Is that something that this group does where the player characters just kind of have a chance to telepathically communicate essentially and figure out what their game plan is going to be? Or is this the sort of
using
thing
their alignment language?
Yeah. Or is this the sort of thing where, well, if the king says something that really pisses off one player character and the other player characters are like, hey, you shouldn't feel like that. Is that something that happens in the world, or is that something that happens outside of the world of the game? And that's I think that really falls under session 0 also, right? It's just establish with the players, this is a game where, when you say something as your character, it happens in the world. So you can't just, put your hand up and say, hey, this dude's an asshole, but we're going to get his money, so it's okay. And because they'll hear that, right? Versus other games where you can just be like, hey, let's, take a 10-minute strategy break and, we'll just all outside of the world of the game say, yeah, this king's an asshole, but we really want his money. So let's just take his money and betray him later. And the king has no idea.
Yep, definitely. So that was a great, all these are great. Well, mine was an okay question, but so far you guys have given us really great questions.
Yeah. I mean, ravens are bigger than crows. That's probably BJ could tell you too, right?
No.
Well, and there aren't ravens.
There's a lot of ravens in Oak.
Right, I thought they're corvidae, right? Both.
No, we only have crows.
Yeah, well, I mean, I see
the ravens till you get farther west.
Yeah. Not okay. I thought I saw crows in Oklahoma, or ravens in Oklahoma. I know New Mexico for sure. You start seeing crows, and they're.
I get some out in the western part of the state.
Honestly, honestly, they're scary big. They're bigger than you think. Ravens are, and then they have like ridges on their teeth. They're like, man, they're carnivorous, aren't they?
Well, and ravens, right? They're like in parts of Europe, right? Ravens will like bond with wolf packs and lead them to prey, and then feed on like the scavenged remains because the wolves can't.
They'll do it in the Rocky Mountains as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because that means that they're all led by a vampire.
I know. That's awesome. That would be a great.
That's a good story.
For a game, right? Is be like you have to find the vampire. The only way to find him is by like tracking the wolf killings because the vampires going around and leading the wolves to slaughter, sort of thing.
Yeah. Which all ties into the Children of the Night, right?
Yeah.
But lovely music. All these are great. Well, mine was an okay question, but so far you guys have given us really great questions. So, Carl, we expect the best out of you.
Yep.
Dang. I don't know. Mine was just going to be games using percentile dice or games using D20.
That's an awesome question.
Why or why not? What is better? And are there, we can discuss like, are there more games? I guess this is in a way prompted because last night I was at the Dragon's Lair and I was looking at Outbreak Undead. And I'm like, man, I never grokked the system. And then I was reading through the player's book. I'm like, oh, wow, it's just like a percentile dice system. That's pretty easy to get your head around. And then we were discussing it, because we use percentile dice for Warhammer Fantasy, for Call of Cthulhu, right? So, I think it's pretty. But then, we're like, oh, but then the D20 system. I mean, I don't know, maybe straight D20 is not so great, but then Modiphius did something brilliant. It added another D20, and now you have like a sort of it's a flattened bell curve, but it's still like a little bit of a bell curve, when it comes to like rolling dice. So it's a 2D20. So I don't know. It's a big question.
Well, I'll throw out my answer really quickly and then let you smarter people answer.
Mhm.
Up till the D20 explosion with D&D 3.5 and all that, with the D&D OGL stuff, you had more D percentile systems. I think now, if you just count number of systems, thanks to the D20 boom, there are probably more D20 systems ultimately, and Arlen will expand on this with Pendragon talk, but ultimately D20 is just D percentile in 5-point increments, right? It effectively a D20 and a D100 roll are the same thing. You're just, the D100 is more granular. I prefer D100 because I like the idea of having the mechanic in there where you can switch the two. So if you roll a 38, you might have the mechanic where you can spend a point, or because of you have a skill that you can change that 38 to an 83. I like that a bit. I like that little tweak. A lot of games, percentile games have, and percentile is really easy to explain to people. D20 is easy to explain to people too, but percentile is, well, what percent chance do I have? If you have a skill 30, you have 30%. So I think I like D percentile. I think there are probably, if we counted by numbers, probably more D20 games out there because of the D20 boom, but I could be wrong on that. And I will throw it to whoever wants to pick it up.
I think you're right. Mathematically, I think even when people use the percentile system, they tend to go in increments of 5, unless the book tells them to do otherwise. And so it's effectively a D20. I think the D percentile is more intuitive, but the D20 is faster when people can use it because it's one roll as opposed to you got to do the mental. It's quick, but you still have to do there's about a second of cogitation where you go, okay, which one was the 10s and which one was the 100s and what does that give me? Yeah, I think I tend to think of D20 just because I played more D&D than anything else. I know statistically it doesn't matter, but there's something more familiar about the D20 to me. But back and forth
D20 though, it's like D20 though. There is a bit of cogitation when you have you have to hit like a DC, right? You have to do some maths, right? Where you, what is my skill number and what is the DC I have to hit? I rolled a D20, now I got to add. So I don't know. Maybe it's what's the speed of recognition versus the speed of addition. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there may be people who aren't familiar with D percentile systems who are put off by the idea from having to deal with thief skills in Dungeons and Dragons, and they think if you're trying to introduce someone to a percentile based system, you need to make it real explicit. Look, this is kind of like a D20. It's just more granular. And just like if we were playing a D20 game, I'm going to give you situational bonuses and penalties and boons and stuff that's going to, and they will be proportionate. I'm not going to give you a +1 bonus on a D percentile roll. I'm going to give you a +5 bonus on a percentile roll, As long as you can explain people the way that math works out the same, I think they'll be fine with it. But I think a lot of people, it's like, oh yeah, I remember this kind of system when I played a thief and I sucked at everything because.
Well, and I think that's part of, in my opinion, a lot of the difference between kind of D percentile and D20 comes down less to the dice and more to the kind of major games that have kind of shaped the culture around those particular systems. Right. So personally, I think D20s roll better than D10s in general, because D10s are weird. So I like using D20s, but also like you can have you can roll 2 D20s for your D100 roll and just, divide the number on each of them by 2 and use one as the 10 digit and one as the 1 digit. Or you can have the special, Jason's going to tell us about the old school dice that just, you
just ignore the pluses
printed twice.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of things there. I think the bigger difference, I think a lot of the people that don't care for D percentile often it has to do with a sort of sense of, especially the kind of Chaosium, or now Chaosium, but kind of historically, there are other people that have published RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu in particular. And, you know, you get the classic criticism of D100 gaming or D percentile gaming is the basket weaving skill in RuneQuest, right? And the idea of, okay, so yes, it sort of fits the idea of being a person who lives in this pre-industrial world who has to figure out something to do with their hands to, you know, survive in their village. But also as an adventurer, you know, when am I ever going to roll basket weaving for something that matters other than maybe for like a, you know, like if you have a salary check for a season or something to see if you, you know, made a little extra money or if you need to dip into your savings sort of thing, right? And of course, the converse of that, I think, is that a lot of the sort of culture around D20s becomes like, oh, D20 games have classes, right? D20 games have levels. D20 games have a sort of, you know, traditional hit point structure and have, you know, a class with a base attack bonus system, right? Or something like that. And of course, I mean, the example, Jason already kind of spoiled it a little bit, but Pendragon, for instance, is a game that uses what is mathematically basically the same thing as old school RuneQuest, where it's just, you have a rating out of 20 and you're trying to roll under on your D20. Well, that's just the same as your D100, but in increments of 5. But then you have a kind of, you know, it's using a D20, but a lot of the kind of mechanical bits in play, you know, you have a much shorter skill list, and often the skill list is much more kind of explicit in Pendragon than in some of the D percentile games where you have lots of, you know, here's all of the kind of, you know, particular wacky skills that you might put on your character sheet, but won't use as much as library use in Call of Cthulhu, that sort of thing. And then you have a, you know, for instance, a combat system that in Pendragon works a little like D&D. It's not quite the same because it's in most versions of Pendragon, it's essentially a contested roll, and it's basically whoever gets the better success on their weapons check does damage, and then you have a damage value that is basically based on how big and tough your character is. That if you have a big and strong character, you get more d6s when you roll damage, and then you subtract the armor value of the target from, and the armor value of the target is based on what type of armor they're wearing and if they're using a shield and all that sort of stuff. But in play, it, I think, is sort of a fairly different, you know, you can see where like a lot of the mathematical elements come from RuneQuest, and plenty of the kind of sort of character emphasis and especially kind of world emphasis elements in Pendragon seem to be similar to RuneQuest. But also there's, you know, it's using a D20, it's not using a D percentile. So if somebody asks you, you know, oh, those D percentile games, they always have basket weaving, and you say, well, here's this game that doesn't. And honestly, I think it's one of the really interesting things that there are games that have kind of pushed back against that in some other ways. The OpenQuest D101 games, I think, is the publisher for that one.
Yeah, Newport's games.
Yeah, there's now, I think they're on the third. OpenQuest 3 is the current one. And it's really interesting because it takes the sort of mathematical structure of roll your D percentile under your skill value, but makes it a lot closer to something even almost like Barbarians of Lemuria sometimes, where you have like, here's a, in that case, they don't have like full on careers, but they do have a fairly short skill list. And one of the other things, one of the kind of interesting pieces of advice in OpenQuest that I remember is don't nickel and dime the players. That if you have a modifier on a roll, have it be of like 25% or more, right? 25% for a small change, 50% for a big change. That's all the modifiers you do. And as a result, you don't do nearly as much of looking up, oh, well, you get a plus 5% for this particular type of tool, but you get a minus 10% because you're working in not so good light. And I think that's another thing that a lot of people end up pushing back against with the percentile is this kind of culture of, well, because you've got so many numbers, you can do so much math as you're trying to figure out what you need to roll your D percentile under. And that, you know, at the core, it's a fairly similar thing, right? You just, you know, roll the dice, try to roll, you know, the right sort of success. But So I don't know. For me, I like rolling in person. I like rolling D20s more than rolling D10s because D10s are weird. Personally, I think the big thing, like I said, a lot of it for me is that the things that I in some ways don't like about both of them have to do more with the kind of culture around those sort of gaming systems that, oftentimes I feel like classes and levels sometimes work, but are not nearly as applicable to everything as the kind of class and level apologists seem to think they are. That, yes, you could make the case that Aragorn is probably a ranger class in Lord of the Rings, but are all the characters in the Fellowship of the Ring really kind of, contained within a class and level structure? And would that actually be any fun to play if you were trying to play that adventure? Or would the people playing Merry and Pippin be like, I'm going to go off for a little while, and they get captured by Uruk-hai for a little while? So, Anyway, but that's sort of my thought, is that often I think my kind of thought about it is less about the dice and more about the kind of how much does a particular system kind of embrace the culture of a lot of the other games that use the similar dice.
I think that's very fair. Carl, did you have thoughts on your question?
No, I'm gonna steal y'all's ideas and answers. Okay. No,
excellent.
I don't know. I think there's pros and cons to both. Really, I do like percentile dice systems, but mainly it's because of the system. But there are maybe I enjoy like a game like Pendragon that uses a D20 but uses it as a that is like more like a percentile dice system as opposed to like a roll the dice, add something to hit a target number, right? Like 3, 5, and then so Pendragon, right? You got to get below, right? So or at, and which I think is pretty interesting. So and it kind of, I like the way they use it in that regard. But and that would be just whether you prefer to roll a D20 or a D10. I don't know. I guess I brought that up because I do like percentile dice systems, because for me they're pretty intuitive.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because there was D&D obviously won out, but when you look at the early TSR games, the only other game that wasn't a D percentile game was Gamma World. Top Secret, Boot Hill, Star Frontiers, Gangbusters. They're all D percentile games. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So which one did you say was not? Gamma World. Gamma World. Gamma World is like D20, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Gamma World's closer to D&D. Yeah. It's very close to AD&D. Yeah. But so it's interesting that there's so many others out there that aren't. Mm-hmm. But no, I mean, obviously, I think we all play both, and then we also play D6 systems, and I think we're all pretty open-minded. We're not, I only play this kind of game.
Mm-hmm. That begs the question. Part of the reason 4th edition D&D tanked was because they killed too many sacred cows of D&D. Mm-hmm. Is D&D a game that would probably run better if they would use a percentile system, but it just can't be done because of at this point, it's legacy.
Rollmaster.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, just play Rollmaster. It's a better game.
Right. So that's for Rollmaster.
Or if you have to have some D20 in there, just switch to Palladium. Play Palladium Fantasy instead.
Yeah. Cool. I guess we're going to listen to MW now.
Yes, time to suck on that crack pipe. So we're going to go ahead and.
I thought it was Worlds of MW, not crack pipe MW. Oh.
Well, I'll let you listen to the calls and we'll see how he does. No,
can we pause to take a break first?
Yeah.
Since it's 11.
Yeah, we will pause at this point.
I don't know.
Well, that was the story my grandmother tells, is that at least in Dallas and Houston, the first buildings that got air conditioning were like the theater opera house places, so that all of the rich women could pull out their furs so that they would look extra nice when the AC was on really cold, because you couldn't wear them any other time in Dallas and Houston.
That's funny.
I was like, okay, so that explains a lot about those two places.
Yeah.
So this set of calls is from MW, the world's MW Lewis, who currently is in Orlando, Florida at GrogCon. We are recording this on the 30th of September. So Arlen's right. It's not the scariest month of the year yet. But GrogCon is going on despite the hurricane. MW flew down there today. Actually, he flew down there this morning from Washington, D.C. He caught a flight down to Orlando to attend the AD&D 1E convention. Another gentleman I know who you'll hear on my podcast, I got an interview with him while he's on the road, drove 18 hours from New Jersey in a Tesla down there to attend the convention, hoping that he would be able to catch charging stations once he got down there. And he was able to. So, people are excited to play AD&D first edition. They're devoted. And MW is one of those brave souls. So let's see what he has to say.
Hello, Cerebrivores. This is first-time caller M.W. Lewis from the world's M.W. Lewis. I'm listening to your current podcast, which is titled S1B16 D&D Controversies Bonus. And there's nothing the M.W. Lewis likes more in his worlds is controversy. Now, I'm at the part of the discussion, maybe 40 minutes in, 40 minutes plus, and you guys are talking about a lot of very important things. These are very serious matters that you are ruminating upon, and much is being posited and suggested and theorized about and and countered, I believe, and some of it might be driven by phone calls. But here's what old MW says. What do you do about the world around the players? How much agency can that world take away from the players? Do they make a deal with the devil or Sauron and then become one of his minions? Is that awful? Does that ruin?
He'll be back here in a second.
All right. Does that? I just realized that sound pipe or crack pipe, whatever the heck this is called,
Yes,
has a minute and a half limit. So I went on and on. I was probably 85 minutes into my call when I realized I got cut off. So does that ruin it for the players? Does the fact that the world around it can act upon them just as much as they can act upon it? And I don't mean the world within an individual adventure, but the greater world around it. So I point back to the modules, the early modules from TSR from the late 70s and the 80s, which I often say the criticism of them is really unfair. Lots of people criticize those modules. There's not a lot of context to them, not a lot of surrounding world building, et cetera, et cetera. But if you play them just simply as how you did back then, you didn't care that the module started with some kind of quick description that said, you're on the road traveling in this direction and ahead of you is a keep on the borderlands. It doesn't say from where you came. It doesn't say what your purpose is. It doesn't really say much. But when you were 14 or 15, you didn't care. Well, at least a lot of people didn't care. Maybe some of you did. But a lot of people just went with it and had a lot of fun going through those modules, all of them, the great modules. But then world building happens and Greyhawk comes out and Forgotten World. So I do think there was a lot of people who actually did care, especially those who were aging out of their early teenage years and started playing the game more as adults, or started really wanting the adventures to match literature that they love to read. So you stop playing it as a child and you start playing as an adult, and you want these worlds and you want all this. So the more the players want that stuff, then the more they have to be open. If a dungeon master is going to take time to create a world around these adventures and around the players, then absolutely that world impacts them and has its own agency. So if the players do not do what the king asked them to do or what they swore to do to the king, they are going to become outlaws, whether that's what they're in the game for or not. That's just where the game takes you. In fact, I play with players today, and we are all adults, and I try to create a lot of context in the world, especially in the early adventures. I try to introduce them. Somebody said, if you don't have the monsters ever flee, the players may think that's not really part of the game, and they may never flee to save their own lives. So I agree. You have to establish these kind of thoughts and expectations early on. So when I have my first few sessions in my game, my Monday night AD&D game, I actually had a few of the players, and I actually had a few of the players, and I read this session description in my podcast, Worlds of M.W. Lewis. I don't remember which episode number, but it wasn't that long ago. Go on trial for fighting bandits on the road. Because in my world, charges were brought against them from the bandits' families who were from a nearby town. And even though the players were actually justified in their actions, which resulted in the death of some of the bandits, justice had to be served. And just like if you read Njal's saga or any of the Icelandic sagas, every time there's a death, there's a trial. There might be revenge later, but it always had a trial. So that's the world we're in, and we did it that way. And the players at first were kind of like, what the you know what? But they ended up liking it, and they dug it. So in the Greyhawk game, players needed to use a high-level cleric, had to hire a high-level cleric to cure their lycanthropy that they had been infected with or suspected they were infected with. And they didn't have the funds as first and second-level characters to pay, and now they're in debt to that church that did the service to them. So what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to just forget about it? Does the fact they're in that church's debt, does that go away just because the players want to just kind of move on to the next adventure? No, I don't think I can forget about it. And, to the credit of the players, a credit to the players is that they don't forget about it either. And they always talk about it. We have this debt. We have this debt. We have to take care of this debt. And one of the players is trying to purchase a mansion outside of Saltmarsh. I won't say any more. Maybe you know the adventure. It's a good module. You won The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. Well, they found the deed to the mansion, and he's trying to buy it. The character's trying to buy it, and he hired a barrister in Saltmarsh. Now, that's a whole little side thing going on and a legal situation going on. Will the characters forget about it when they move on to the next adventure? Should we just erase those storylines and pretend they didn't happen? Or do we let the world, or do they operate in that world? Are we trying to make a world that, just like the world we live in today, any action you take has a ripple effect that could impact you later on? I think as a kid, back when I was 13, 14, 15, we probably didn't want to play within those confines. Even if we were playing Greyhawk, we probably didn't want the outer world to really interfere too much with our adventuring. But I feel when you're older and adults play, except if you're playing one-shots, if you're in campaign mode, I do think the world will take agency away from the player. I hate speak pipe, but agency can be taken away from the players by the world they are in and they are operating in. And in addition, the retainers and the henchmen have their own agency too. So one of you, and I apologize, I've been working while listening to you, so I didn't catch all your names or I wasn't recognizing all your voices. You all sound exactly alike. Just kidding. You actually don't. But one of you was saying, I made a mistake by letting my players always play the henchmen. And I believe Jason was saying you shouldn't, the DM shouldn't do that. And I 100% agree. All henchmen and retainers should have agency in the world you're in. Otherwise, you're really just playing a video game where, there's a bunch of characters. I think of the Borderlands series of PS3 and Xbox games. It's a great game, by the way. I really enjoy it. My son likes it. I don't buy it myself, but I've played it because my son has it. There's a lot of NPC type characters that assist you in those games, and they're just cardboard cutouts that are there to assist you. I think in Dungeons and Dragons and other RPG games, the NPCs need to be played by the game master or the dungeon master and should definitely have their own agency. And in fact, the DMG has rules specific to this. One of the nice things about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons versus Basic, if you want to talk about muddling rules, the the DMG provides a lot of expansive discussion to guide the dungeon master into allowing those henchmen and retainers to have agency. I do know when I played basic, those retainers and NPCs were just totally cardboard cutouts. They were the beef shields, or they actually became a second character in some cases, played by one of the players, and they really had no impact in the game at all, or they added nothing of value to the world you were playing in. They were just a tool. They were just another weapon used by the players, and that's a shame. But when you're playing as a kid, again, you don't care about that. As an adult, you begin to appreciate the nuances that can be created into the game if a DM takes over those roles. So, in fact, both my games have had really fun and interesting sessions because of the NPC or the retainer / henchman agency, which has caused trouble, or maybe the players themselves underestimated that how their actions, or they underestimated how their actions and their failure to treat henchmen properly resulted in situations they did not want. And I don't think any of them are mad about it either. They accept it. They understand what happened, why a situation didn't work out the way they wanted it to. And they either will change their behavior next time, or they'll continue to have the same results. So anyway, I'm enjoying your show. I don't get to listen to Cerebrivore very much, but I'm enjoying this episode immensely. Thank you.
I had totally forgotten how much that plays. I listened to it initially when it came in. I forgot how much it played into BJ's question for It's All. So,
yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So that's MW's answer to your question, BJ. You're muted. Looks like.
All right.
Bingo. I won.
Very good. As he was talking about that, I was thinking about, and you can find various blog posts and some YouTube videos on the Hickman Revolution. Some of them good, and some people critical of the influence that Tracy Hickman had on the direction of D&D, as he introduced a concept of abandoning sort of random, contrived sandbox play. Well, we're doing this because we're here to play D&D. There's the dungeon, go for it. And really into more of wanting the players to have motivations other than just killing and looting. Having a plot or a story that goes into weaves into the adventure. The dungeons making sense logically is like, why would anybody build a dungeon like this? Why would you have a 50-foot long corridor separate, and then attainable ends, within a couple of sessions. So look, we need to have a story that has a beginning, a middle, and end. And after 1 or 2 sessions, there's a plot, there's some resolution to the plot. And some people like that and some people don't, but that seems to be, I know he's talking about, there was a shift in the 80s, and it made me think of, I don't know how much the so-called Hickman Revolution has to do with what MW is talking about, but it certainly sparked my memory there that there was that shift in the 80s from, again, there's the dungeon, go for it, to now, why are my players here? What do they really want out of this? What's their backstory? My method acting. What's my motivation? Well, your motivation is if you don't do anything, then we'll call it a night and I'll see you next week.
Well, I think a lot of it, and MW, I think, acknowledges this pretty well, that a lot of it just comes down to what sort of game that the players and the GM want to play, right? Is the group in the, let's kick down some doors and roll some dice to kill some kobolds and take their gold back to town mode, or are we in the, we want to do the, let's go to the library and find the, old text that has all this kind of secret information about the king so that we can blackmail the king into, sending extra gold to the merchant guild so that they can, all that sort of, much more kind of intrigue, kind of world engagement, for lack of a better term, stuff. I thought it was funny. So for those of us who were not teenagers in the 70s who did not start with those AD&D sort of things. I actually, my part of the reason that I bounced off of D&D when I was younger, D&D in particular, was that I got the 3rd edition Player's Handbook for Christmas when I was in 7th grade, maybe. I don't remember exactly. My grandmother wrote a thing in the front cover so I could figure it out. But anyway, the point being, one of the things that I really bounced off of was the way that certain kind of mechanical structures worked, like especially armor class. I was like, well, okay, so basically with the way that the weight system and the armor class in this game works, there's no reason at all for me to wear lighter armor unless I hit the 100% weight limit and I'm actually over encumbered. But as a kid who was not a very good Boy Scout and was seriously out of shape, I know exactly how much it is uncomfortable to carry more weight in your backpack when you don't need to carry that weight, right? That feels totally right. Like, is Aragorn really going to be like, well, my AC is better in the chainmail, so that's what I'm wearing from now on? Or is he going to be like, well, we're traveling overland for a while, so going to trim all the weight down that I can, even if it's not the binary encumbered, over encumbered, and then put on the chainmail shirt for the big battle where you're going to need that sort of thing. And that was one of the big things that I bounced off of, was that I felt like the kind of rule structured elements made it much more difficult to play the sort of stories that I was interested in as a kid. But I also think I think one of the big things that comes into play, especially as you start to do the sort of larger world stuff, and if you have rules, or even if you're not necessarily using kind of rules to structure a lot of those things, is that those elements, the kind of underlying assumptions, especially the kind of structural assumptions, once you start to apply rules to those things, they start to matter in a way that they don't when you don't really engage with those things. So I think about there's a game that I remember that the game has very, very detailed demographic information for all these different kingdoms within this world. And the character generation involves a pretty substantial element of, you roll for your character's, social class background. And based on that, you get a certain level of education. And so there's different tables for education for the different social classes and all that sort of stuff. Fairly extensive role procedure for all that sort of stuff. And then at the end of all this section, talking about player characters and NPCs and how to kind of generate up adventurers, there's one table that is the character's kind of political philosophy. And basically it has, I don't remember, 5 or 6 slots. And I think it's, 0 to 40 on a percentile is basically ambivalent, not really any strong political feelings anyway. And then I think it's 3 more, and it's conservative, moderate, liberal as the next 60% for the 100%. The sort of point that I'm getting at there is that, okay, so you can see the idea of like having a character randomly roll, but when you compare the political opinion table that takes into account nothing of the character's background that's established in all these other tables versus all the other tables that use all of these different things to reflect on each other, that starts to feel much more like a base assumption of the author, right? Is the author assuming that everyone is just ambivalent, conservative, moderate, or liberal, and that they're, the background that they grew up in and their level of education and all of these things that we know in the real world have an effect on the likely political positions a person is likely to kind of identify with? Do those not take place in this world, right? Do these various groups, for instance, to get a little more political, do the people in power not have like a vested interest in maintaining that power in this world? Or is it just, you just totally random. You just grow up and decide how you feel about all this sort of stuff. And that, especially as you get into much more of the kind of world engagement stuff, I think that's where those issues and those elements start to crop up, I guess is the way to put it. That when you have what starts to feel like kind of weird assumptions, things that don't actually kind of mesh entirely, especially because the real world is a complicated place. And so when you start to put more emphasis on making a secondary world more like the real world, I think you end up with those sorts of things, right? That you end up with the, well, why does it make it right? Why do dwarves always use axes? Shouldn't they use pikes instead? Because they're short and they like to fight in, close ranks. So historically, that's what people did using pikes, not battle axes and shields. How much do you buy into that versus how much you say, well, we like dwarves with battle axes and shields, so we're going to use it anyway, even though it makes more sense for them to, dress more like 16th century Landsknechts rather than looking like this kind of weird Viking characters.
Carl?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting point, like NPC agency and everything that he talked about, and then also character motivation. I really like how he set things up for his players, and it goes back to showing how MW really has set up the world and communicated to his players, this is the way it's going to go. And I like how he also comments about, way back when we first started playing this, we didn't really care about that, but now it's important, which I think, it shows a maturity in his group and, their gaming and how it's changed and evolved over time, from, maybe more of a hack and slash, or we don't worry about what's going on outside of the dungeon, but now we do. So he had a lot of really great points that makes me we should bring him onto the show and talk about a lot of those maybe in more detail, although he's pretty thorough, I think. But I think it's pretty neat. I really love that you can take, and that's the beauty of these older adventures, is that because there is no expectation of the outer framework. There's no Hickman effect and meta plot and meta story. There's no Ed Greenwood and Elminster puffing on pipeweed and telling you how the world works. It's kind of like you make it up as you go, and I think that's really showing forth in how the beauty of like Moldvay, say for example, in the Lost City, and reading through its outline in the original one, and then how in the 5e they've expanded it, which is pretty fascinating, and how you can expand it, and how the outline was there for you back in the original incarnation of the Lost City with Moldvay, and to make it more of a campaign. But here's the structure, go for it. Here's some ideas, but it's up to you to decide how these NPCs are going to react, how the players are going to interact with the NPCs. So I think, and that makes those products, I think, more maybe a little more malleable, right? Compared to, unfortunately, like as much as I love Zeb Cook, some of the stuff he did with Dark Sun is so railroady. You might as well just sit back on the coal car in the train. It's kind of neat how these older products, maybe they had that. They're thinking more of of let's let the GMs of the world put in their own ideas for how their campaign is going to work, as opposed to like, here's the meta plot, now the players have to play this meta plot, right? And I think that's very interesting, and I think that a lot of what MW kind of alluded to is in that in his call.
That's when I think of like D&D, where I sometimes struggle with official products, and this goes back to Wizards, the TSR, not just with kind of Wizards of the Coast, is on one hand, D&D is a toolkit for you to develop fantasy adventures for your players. On the one hand, it's nice for them to give you sort of an implied or default cosmology and set of deities, and but sometimes I feel like, and this will happen with every edition. They'll go back to basics and they'll start adding more and more and more and more and updating the lore. And at some point, it's sort of like there can be a pressure, depending on who you're playing with, to I don't just have to observe the rules of D&D, the mechanics of D&D, for us to be playing D&D. Demogorgon has to be on the bottom layer of the abyss, or we're not playing D&D. Pelor is the god of the sun, or we're not playing D&D. Goblins worship Maglubiet, or we're not playing D&D. And I remember one of the I've generally enjoyed 5e, but one of the first products where I was kind of like, I don't think I really care for this approach was the Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. It had some really cool monsters in it and some really cool mechanics. But I don't like the game designers telling me what my setting is. Well, this is how demons work. Well, what if I don't want them to work that way? And it kind of gets back to the alignment thing is where, well, why is alignment important? Well, because there are whole planes of existence dedicated to those alignments. Like, well, who says? What if that doesn't exist in my world? Now what's the utility of alignment? You know, when you strip away the narrative of it, because I want to play a different kind of setting, how do I use this now? And I think you can't, it helps to have those default implications of, well, this is kind of what a ranger is, and this is kind of what a paladin is. That's good when you're starting out and you're a novice as a DM, but at some point when you want to try to customize stuff for your group and give them a new experience instead of the same thing we've been doing for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, baggage of sort of the narrative that goes with it, where, you know, I guess what I'm talking about is, if you look at some of that older stuff before they started filling in those blanks on the map and those, you know, Contact Higher Plane mentioned 12 planes of existence, but it didn't really tell you much about what was there other than maybe the degree to which the residents would be honest with you if you asked them a question. Versus now we've got the Great Wheel and it's all mapped out and you can put it on it's like the opening of Game of Thrones where you can put it all in a dynamic, I remember what you call those things. Anyway, I don't know where I'm going with that. That was just my reaction there.
No, I think he brought up some interesting points, and I will invite him to come on. We'll come up with an appropriate topic for him, as long as it's, you know, D&D related. I think MW is very happy to join in. You know, maybe he can tell us a little bit about how GrogCon went, and we can talk, because he's getting to play. So this is actually, even though he played a bunch as a kid back in the day, he never went to tournaments or conventions back in the kid. So this is only his second convention. And he's going to get play some tournaments down there, which he hasn't been able to do before. So it'll be interesting to hear what he thinks of old school tournaments. But I think our time is to a close, gentlemen. I thank you for joining me for this session of Cerebrivore.
If I can hop in for just a second, because BJ said something that I thought was really a good point to sort of pick out, which is the way that the kind of D&D, the sort of line contracts and expands as they move through editions. As well as, I think one of the interesting things is the way that just from the kind of starting point, like, you know, the first book for each edition, there's different changes. I actually think that's one of the big things that a lot of the sort of grognard types react badly to with 5th edition, is not just the sort of mechanical stuff about proficiency and all of these different things, but also that tieflings and dragonborn are character races in the player's handbook, and so the expectation is you can just choose to be a tiefling or a dragonborn, as opposed to in a lot of the, you know, older games where it's like, no, tieflings are super rare, right? That the, you know, people see a person with blue skin and horns and they're like, what the hell is wrong with you? Burn you at the stake, sort of thing.
Well, Carl can speak. That's a good point. But, you know, Carl can speak to this because that was an issue even back in the day. Think about when Unearthed Arcanum came out, and now all of a sudden you can play Drow, right?
Yeah.
Or BJ probably can too. But I mean, that was a big deal, you know, when they all of a sudden threw all these new races at you.
Well, and God forbid they make one race that has better stats than the other races, because everybody is going to play that one from now on, right?
Yeah, so that's not that's not a 5e.
Well, they keep, the Drow were your edgy, they were your go-to race for the edgelords, and then they kind of tamed them, and so now then the tieflings, well, there's your go-to race for the edgelords, and they've kind of made them cute and cuddly now, and
you'll be the gnolls next, because the gnolls are your demon things, right? So they'll be the next one.
I think that they're kind of getting away from many of the look at kind of the way they're describing races and
races are not mono. What is it called?
There's no monoculture.
But there's no monoculture in races, right?
Yeah, now you're gonna have to be
anyway,
like a Witcher, right? You're a mutant. I'm not a regular person. I'm a person who's gone through the trial of grasses, and I have weird cat eyes and carry not one but 2 swords and fuck anything that moves, because that's basically Geralt's character qualities.
Yeah. So, and the way you fix that is you just eliminate any bonuses for whatever their genetic heritage is.
That's what
You can
they've
look
done.
however you
That's
want.
what they've done. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that
And that's just
eliminates
what sort of skin you want and what
Right.
what
Yeah,
background.
exactly.
But I mean, all that's
which makes it more of a video game.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, it's like in
Well-
Skyrim when you choose a character race and what's his name, the Imperial dude is like, "Oh, a long way from the Imperial City, aren't you?" And then nobody comments on it again in the game because the only thing that matters is basically that you get one at will once per day power from that, and that's basically it.
Yep.
But we are running a little bit long, so we are going to cut this off here. But this is definitely something we could pick up at another point.
Yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you, MW, for calling in. Take care of yourselves,
All right.
and I will talk to you all soon.
A Nerd Central broadcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the Simon Strong. The All Stars and Pods past, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Some things brain teeth, or escaping your brain. But I mean is this machines a fake and from what I understand don't look now, this people is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can bring it, you can hide, I'll be above in any order. Just another ring of people tossers running for the border. Just a snack like a one, can I stutter? Beer and hate, it's always bread and butter. You can eat on a billion, and it's just never faded. It's savoring the flavor of the movies it created.
BJ doesn't seem like a big fan of Palladium.
I just haven't played that much. So
I mean, obviously it's dated now, right? But at the time, it's a very refreshing change from D&D. I mean, it's effectively D&D house rules, but because it came out like 84 or 85. But you've got active defenses, you have dodges, parries, you have armor. The way armor works is really nice because say you have an AC of 10, a 4 or higher hits, kind of like Savage Worlds, still D20, but a 4 or higher hits. If you roll under the armor class, then the armor absorbs the damage, and armor has a certain amount of structural SDC, has a certain amount of damage it can take before the armor is destroyed. If you roll over the armor, then you bypass the armor and do damage directly to their hit points. So it makes armor more meaningful. Plus, like say, you can do dodges and parries and things. So it does interesting there. And then like all the satanic panic things, all the things that they talk about satanic panic are ramped up to 11 in Palladium Fantasy. And it was totally off the radar. Like you have a witch class that is truly a witch. Like you need like a 5 intelligence and you can be a witch. Like that's it. Cause you give yourself in service to some demon, they pump up your stats and give you all kinds of spells and stuff. But you have summoners, you have, all the bad things that you think about, they're all in there. Every race has a percentage of being a cannibal. I mean, you don't have to lean into that stuff, but it's a really neat system. It's pretty innovative. And then once I got into Rifts, unfortunately, if you ever get around to picking it up, you want to pick up first edition, not second, because second edition was after Rifts came out, and then they decided they had to make everything Rifts compatible. So second edition Palladium Fantasy is changed to be more compatible with Rifts. So they kind of changed some things up, but the first edition is still a pretty solid game by itself. It's actually pretty interesting. Thing with Rifts is you have mega damage, because you have to differentiate between the idea, like a lot of games do, of it's like Robotech, right? If you're familiar with Robotech, your handheld weapons aren't going to do damage to the mecha, but the mecha weapons are obviously going to do damage to people. So you have to differentiate that. So mega damage is 1 point of regular damage 100 points of regular damage is 1 point of mega damage. And then but you get to the point where your characters are running around with mega damage weapons. So you know, your character has a blaster that just turns somebody into a pile of goo with one shot. And then you have other characters, because it's not balanced at all. You have other characters running around like rogue scientists, or like you have beggars in there, or they're not called beggars. I forget what they're called, like vagrants or something, that have like nothing. So, you know, he's got like an old 38 or a knife or a bow and arrow, and everybody else is running with these, you know, laser weapons that are to atomize people. And so, you know, there's like there's zero sense of balance in it. But
yeah, which is, I mean, so what if you want to play? So you have to say, I guess, caution players. Well, I know you want to play this, but if the other players are going to play this type of thing, you should play this, right? I guess that should have
right? Yeah, yeah, it's got to be the idea. Everybody's got to be on board for what the campaign is. I don't think the game's broken because of that, but people have to be on board with it. Like say I'm playing a vagrant and I don't have, you know, you're playing a juicer who's somebody that's kind of like Bane, effectively, right? And for BJ, who probably doesn't remember Rifts at all, but juicer's like Bane. He's got these, so he's super fast, super strong, can do all the cool stuff. Obviously, he's going to outclass my vagrant in just about everything. But my vagrant is smart. He knows how to hotwire cars. He knows this and that. And it's just, you know, if you have a group that's mature enough to be able to balance out that, you know, where you're not just going to not all be combat, then you could have a totally fun game. But if you're going to always be in combat, then you're never going to play those other kind of characters, because, you know, they're useless. So it just depends on it depends on.
There's probably in any system, there's a, it's kind of on the GM to provide every character its moment to do what it does and not be eclipsed. Like, I don't think you necessarily have to play the kind of system where, okay, well, we're going to do point buy, so everybody has the exact same stats, and you just decide which ones are high and low, and everything is evenly balanced. That's probably a good idea when it's people who haven't played with each other, and you're playing a pickup game or a game at a game store where it's just kind of an open table. But I think once people kind of get to know each other and you know your players, you can do that in balance, because you can then make space for people to show off the choices they made and the way they built their characters and what they do, you know.
Right. Where it comes in with Rifts, where it's more tricky on the GM and Rifts is, so if you have a character who's a dragon, because you can play a dragon. If you have a dragon, you have a glitter boy, which is a mecha, you know, and you have a full conversion Borg, right? All these are mega damage creatures that do friggin', you know, every roll is 1 times 100 damage, that kind of stuff. And then you got your vagrant who's running around with his revolver and his knife. Well, any combat you get in, if that vagrant is hit, because anybody that's coming up against the mecha is also using mega damage weapons. So unfortunately, your other characters are super squishy. and so that's where it gets really tough. If it was just, you know, oh, you're good in combat and you're good out of combat, it'd be one thing. But the problem is, because of the damage thing, it gets it where your squishy characters are effectively, if they don't hide during if they can't hide during combat, they're dead.
Justice League, you've always got to give Batman a bomb to defuse, or a you know.
Well, that's like where you see
skill challenge, because
when they go to Apocalypse, come on, what Batman doesn't belong on Apocalypse. Let's be honest. You know, humans don't belong on Apocalypse. So Wonder Woman and Superman go to Apocalypse, that's fine. But the idea of these regular humans going to Apocalypse and surviving, you know, it's ridiculous.